certainly trying to get a physics view of consciousness, yes, there has to be a connecting point, and it could be at the very axiomatic, at the very beginning level. But I mean, first of all, there's a crazy idea that everything has properties of consciousness. At that point, the word consciousness is already beyond the reach of our current understanding, like far, because it's so far from, at least for me, maybe you can correct me, it's far from the experiences that we have, that I have as a human being. To say that everything is conscious, that means that basically, another way to put that, if that's true, then we understand almost nothing about that fundamental aspect of the world.
How do you feel about saying an ant is conscious? Do you get the same reaction to that, or is that something you can understand?
I can understand ant. I can't understand an atom, a particle. Plant. So I'm comfortable with living things on Earth being conscious, because there's some kind of agency where they're similar size to me, and they can be born and they can die, and that is understandable intuitively. Of course, you anthropomorphize, you put yourself in the place of the plant, but I can understand it. I mean, I'm not like I don't believe actually that plants are conscious or that plants suffer, but I can understand that kind of belief, that kind of idea.
How do you feel about robots, like the kind of robots we have now? If I told you like that, a Roomba had some degree of consciousness, or some deep neural network,
I could understand that a Roomba has consciousness. I just had spent all day at iRobot. I personally love robots and have a deep connection with robots, so I also probably anthropomorphize them. But there's something about the physical object. So there's a difference than a neural network running in software. To me, the physical object, something about the human experience allows me to really see that physical object as an entity. And if it moves, and moves in a way that I didn't program it, where it feels that it's acting based on its own perception. And yes, self-awareness and consciousness, even if it's a Roomba, then you start to assign it some agency, some consciousness. So, but to say that panpsychism, that consciousness is a fundamental property of reality, is a much bigger statement. That it's like turtles all the way. It's like it doesn't end. The whole thing is, so like, how, I know it's full of mystery, but if you can linger on it, like how do you think about reality if consciousness is a fundamental part of its fabric?
The way you get there is from thinking, can we explain consciousness given the existing fundamentals? And then if you can't, as at least right now it looks like, then you've got to add something. It doesn't follow that you have to add consciousness. Here's another interesting possibility is, well, we'll add something else. Let's call it proto-consciousness, or X.
Right.
And then it turns out space, time, mass plus X will somehow collectively give you the possibility for consciousness. So I don't rule out that view. Either I call that pan-proto-psychism, because maybe there's some other property, proto-consciousness, at the bottom level. And if you can't imagine there's actually genuine consciousness at the bottom level, I think we should be open to the idea there's this other thing, X. Maybe we can't imagine that somehow gives you consciousness. But if we are playing along with the idea that there really is genuine consciousness at the bottom level, of course, this is going to be way out and speculative. But, at least in, say, if it was classical physics, then you'd end up saying, well, every little atom, with a bunch of particles in space-time, each of these particles has some kind of consciousness whose structure mirrors maybe their physical properties, like its mass, its charge, its velocity, and so on. The structure of its consciousness would roughly correspond to that. And the physical interactions between particles. I mean, there's this old worry about physics. I mentioned this before in this issue about the manifest image. We don't really find out about the intrinsic nature of things. Physics tells us about how a particle relates to other particles and interacts. It doesn't tell us about what the particle is in itself. That was Kant's thing in itself. So here's a view. The nature in itself of a particle is something mental. A particle is actually a little conscious subject with properties of its consciousness that correspond to its physical properties. The laws of physics are actually ultimately relating these properties of conscious subjects. So in this view, a Newtonian world actually would be a vast collection of little conscious subjects at the bottom level, way, way simpler than we are, without free will or rationality or anything like that. But that's what the universe would be like. Now, of course, that's a vastly speculative view. No particular reason to think it's correct. Furthermore, non-Newtonian physics, say a quantum mechanical wave function, suddenly it starts to look different. It's not a vast collection of conscious subjects. Maybe there's ultimately one big wave function for the whole universe. Corresponding to that might be something more like a single conscious mind whose structure corresponds to the structure of the wave function. People sometimes call this cosmopsychism. And now, of course, we're in the realm of extremely speculative philosophy. There's no direct evidence for this. But if you want a picture of what that universe would be like, think, giant cosmic mind with enough richness and structure among it to replicate all the structure of physics.
I think, therefore, I am at the level of particles, and with quantum mechanics at the level of the wave function. It's kind of an exciting, beautiful possibility, of course, way out of reach of physics currently.
It is interesting that some neuroscientists are beginning to take panpsychism seriously, that you find consciousness even in very simple systems. So, for example, the integrated information theory of consciousness, a lot of neuroscientists are taking seriously. Actually, I just got this new book by Christoph Koch, just came in, The Feeling of Life Itself, Why Consciousness is Widespread but Can't Be Computed. He basically endorses a panpsychist view where you get consciousness with the degree of information processing or integrated information processing in a system, and even very, very simple systems, like a couple of particles, will have some degree of this. So he ends up with some degree of consciousness in all matter. And the claim is that this theory can actually explain a bunch of stuff about the connection between the brain and consciousness. Now, that's very controversial. I think it's very, very early days in the science of consciousness. But it's interesting that it's not just philosophy that might lead you in this direction, but there are ways of thinking quasi-scientifically that lead you there too.